Let's start with a question, a really profound one. What if the most bewildering, the most frightening symptoms of mental illness, what if they weren't just the random noise of a broken brain? What if instead they were messages? This was the radical proposition from Carl Jung, and it fundamentally challenged everything we thought we knew, suggesting that the roots of mental disease might not be in our biology, but in our psyche.
So, here's our path for today. We'll begin with the central puzzle of madness as it was understood back then. We'll look at the dominant theory that it was all a matter of brains. Then we'll dive into Jung's revolutionary idea of psychogenesis, see how he thought the unconscious breaks through, and wrap up with why this shift in thinking is still so incredibly important today.
You have to remember, at the turn of the 20th century, the intellectual climate was overwhelmingly materialistic. So when a psychiatrist looked at a patient exhibiting strange delusions or bizarre behaviors, the assumption was simple. This was just the sad, meaningless byproduct of faulty brain cells. It was noise, the static of a physical machine on the fritz.
And this really was the fundamental question that created a deep divide in the field. Was this madness truly just arbitrary neural chaos? Or, and this was the radical part, could it actually be communicating something psychologically significant, if only we had the tools to listen?
The prevailing view, the dogma of the era, was straightforward, it was powerful, and honestly, it left very little room for any kind of psychological investigation. Now, think about the consequences of an axiom like this. It meant that all serious research, all the funding, all the intellectual energy was funneled into physical causes, dissecting brain anatomy, studying cellular pathology, searching for metabolic toxins. The patient's life story, their inner world, their conflicts, their essential humanity, well, that was often seen as irrelevant, secondary at best.
Even the best psychological theory of the day, which came from the great Eugene Bleuler, was still somewhat mechanical. He coined this term ambivalence to explain the perplexing, often contradictory behavior you see in schizophrenia. His idea was that in a schizophrenic mind, opposites just kind of exist side by side, without any filter, leading to these confusing or contrary actions.
But Carl Jung, who was actually Bleuler's student at the time, found this explanation, well, incomplete. To him, it felt like it described what was happening, but it never really got to the why. And his search for that why is what led to his central and, for the time, incredibly radical idea.
Jung put forward this idea of psychogenesis. He argued that the essential cause wasn't necessarily a brain lesion or a faulty gene, but an event that happened within the psyche. The illness, he believed, had a psychological history. It had a story. And if it had a story, it could be understood.
And this is where we see the genius of Jung's reframing. For Bleuler, ambivalence was a passive state. Opposites just kind of coexist randomly. But for Jung, it wasn't passive at all. It was an active resistance. He argued that the opposition, the negativism, isn't random. It's being purposefully generated by a deeper, unresolved psychological knot he called a complex. Suddenly, the symptom isn't just noise, it's the sound of a very real inner battle.
Okay, so if this is a psychic process, how does it actually work? Well, Jung proposed this beautiful, dynamic model based on the relationship between our conscious mind and its powerful, hidden counterpart, the unconscious.
He explained that in a psychologically healthy person, the unconscious is constantly working to create balance. It compensates for whatever our conscious attitude is. So, if you're consciously a big spender, your unconscious is a miser. If you see yourself as a great philanthropist, your unconscious is probably a raging egoist. These opposites hold the personality together in a kind of healthy, dynamic tension.
Jung gives this fantastic example of a respectable merchant. Consciously, this guy is a pillar of the community, virtuous, hard-working, enlightened, but his unconscious is compensating for this one-sidedness, and it leaks out in these little symptomatic actions, as Freud would call them. His laziness shows up in unanswered letters, his untrustworthiness in his tax filings, his superstition and a secret fear of Friday the 13th. These are just small leaks that actually help maintain the overall balance.
But in mental illness, this whole system shatters. And here's how it happens. First, a person develops an extreme, rigid, one-sided conscious attitude. The unconscious, doing its job, creates a powerful compensation to restore balance. But, and this is the absolute key, the individual actively resists this inner correction. They fight it. That resistance builds up an enormous amount of psychic pressure until finally the dam breaks. The unconscious erupts violently into consciousness, and its contents spill out as the bizarre, distorted symptoms of psychosis.
And this real clinical case illustrates the point perfectly. Jung tells of a woman who was wrongly confined, accused of being mad, and in a moment of defiance, she declared, "You shall see what madness means," and immediately fell into a catatonic state. You see? Her psychosis wasn't just some random brain event. It was a direct, deeply meaningful, though of course pathological, psychological reaction. It was a distorted fulfillment of what was being demanded of her.
Now, Jung wasn't arguing that biology played no role at all. He wasn't a psychological purist. He saw it more as a chain of conditions. It might begin with a biological predisposition, maybe an abnormal sensitiveness. This sensitivity then causes the person to experience a perfectly normal psychological conflict, something we all go through, with an overwhelming, unmanageable intensity. And finally, that intensity leads to a failed adaptation, an inability to resolve the conflict, which becomes the final trigger for the psychic breakdown.
So what's the ultimate impact of all this? What's the big takeaway? Well, by shifting the cause from a brain lesion to a psychological story, Jung fundamentally reframed the very nature and meaning of the illness itself.
You can see this entire process laid out in the tragic story of a young teacher Jung treated. Her psychosis didn't come out of nowhere. It was the predictable, tragic endpoint of a long, understandable psychological journey. It started with a shameful event in her teens, which created a massive conflict when she later fell deeply in love. Her attempt to escape that unbearable emotion through a radical religious conversion was the final, desperate act that severed her connection to reality, allowing her inner world to erupt into consciousness as powerful hallucinations.
And this brings us right to the heart of the matter. The symptoms are not meaningless noise. They are a message, even if it's scrambled. For Jung, a hallucination isn't just a misfiring neuron. It is the symbolic language of the unconscious, breaking through in a desperate last-ditch attempt to restore a balance that the conscious mind has dangerously and stubbornly ignored.
So this new perspective is really a bundle of revolutionary ideas. It insists that psychosis is not just organic, that it is psychologically meaningful, that it has a clear psychic causality, a story you can follow, and maybe the most radical idea of all, that it can be understood as a catastrophic, horribly misguided attempt at self-healing.
And this leaves us with a truly provocative final thought. Jung's revolution suggests that our goal shouldn't be to simply silence our symptoms more and more efficiently. Perhaps the first and most important task is to learn how to listen to them, to ask, what are they trying to tell us from the deepest parts of our own psyche?